All right, let's dive in today. We're going deep into a world, well, a world of sunshine, existentialism, and some seriously questionable decisions. We're going to be unpacking excerpts from Albert Camus's The Stranger. And let's be real for a second. This book, it features one of literature's most, well, most perplexing characters ever, Meursault. So our mission today is to really understand this guy, his actions, his motivations, and why The Stranger is still such a powerful book, even decades after it was published.
The Stranger is really a cornerstone of existentialist literature. It kind of throws us right into the deep end, right from those first few lines. It's famous for its exploration of meaning, or maybe the lack of meaning, in a world that often seems indifferent to us, to human existence.
Yeah, and right from the start, we're confronted with Mersault's reaction to his mother's death. And it's definitely not what you call a typical reaction. He gets the telegram, travels to the nursing home, attends the vigil, the funeral. But he does it all with this kind of a strange sense of detachment.
Yeah, Camus, he really focuses on Mersault's preoccupation with the physical world, almost like he's hyper-aware of the heat, that bus ride, even just a taste of the coffee, more than he is with his own grief. You remember that part where he's fixated on the caretaker's bandaged face instead of, his own mother.
Yeah, I remember that. It's almost like he's experiencing everything through this filter, one that prioritizes these sensory details over any kind of emotional response.
Exactly, and that sets the stage for what he does after the funeral instead of, engaging in the typical mourning period. That we'd all expect. He goes swimming, starts a relationship with Marie, and gets caught up in all his neighbor Raymond's drama.
It's like all these actions, these choices that seem so jarring, maybe they offer us a glimpse into Camus's whole philosophy of existentialism. What if, and this is just a thought, what if these actions aren't just signs of indifference, but rather expressions of Meursault's freedom to create meaning in a world that just doesn't have any inherent purpose?
That's a very interesting interpretation. Because to most people, the traditional mourning period, it provides some structure, some meaning.
Yeah.
When you're facing a loss like that, but for Mersault, I don't know, maybe those societal expectations, they just don't hold any real weight for him. And his choices, they're more about embracing the present moment.
It's like he's living in a world where the rules, the normal rules, they just don't apply to him.
Exactly. And this disregard for all those social norms, it becomes even more apparent. In that scene on the beach, that pivotal scene, Camus, he does this amazing job of building up the tension with all those sensory details, the heat, that blinding sun, the glint of the knife. It's almost like these overwhelming physical sensations. They culminate in the shooting, as if the environment itself is pushing Mersault toward this act.
And even the way Camus describes the shooting, it's so striking. It's not portrayed as this moment of passion or even revenge, really. Yeah. It's almost like this mechanical thing, detached.
It is, as if the physical reality of that exact moment, not any kind of internal struggle or anything, but that's what drives Meursault's actions. It makes us think about Camus' whole philosophy of the absurd, the idea that human existence is inherently meaningless when you put it up against a universe that's indifferent to our suffering and even our aspirations. So could this act, this shooting, be seen as a consequence of Meursault's understanding of the world?
It's a good question to think about. And this event, of course, leads to Meursault's imprisonment and his trial. Yeah. And it's during this time that his unusual behavior and his detachment, they really become the central focus. It's as if he's speaking a different language, unable or maybe unwilling to play the role that society expects of him.
The trial itself, it becomes less about the crime he committed and more about Meursault himself, about his character. He's judged not just for killing that man, but for his indifference to his mother's death, his lack of remorse, his whole unconventional way of being.
So it's like he's on trial for just being himself.
Exactly, and it's right here that we're introduced to the chaplain, who, he really tries to offer Mersault hope and salvation even. But Mersault, well, he's not buying it. He rejects the chaplain's attempts to impose meaning on a world that Mersault sees as fundamentally meaningless.
This is where that concept of the gentle indifference of the world that Camus talks about, it really comes into play.
Yeah, Mersault doesn't just reject religious dogma. He's rejecting this whole framework of societal norms and expectations. He finds freedom in accepting the absurd, in living authentically, even if that authenticity makes other people uncomfortable.
And that final encounter between them, it's so full of tension. Mersault just explodes. He has this sudden outburst, and then the chaplain breaks down crying. It's like this clash between two completely different worldviews.
Oh, absolutely. You've got the chaplain clinging to faith and meaning, and then you have Mersault finding comfort in acceptance and what others might call indifference that makes us stop and ask ourselves, is there a right way or a wrong way to face these challenges, these big life challenges? Or is it all just a matter of perspective?
And speaking of perspective, it's interesting how Mersault finds peace. Even as he's waiting for his execution, he reflects on his life, on his mother, on the choices he's made, and he reaches this place of acceptance.
And what's really striking is his final desire. He wants to be greeted with cries of hate from the crowd at his execution. He wants their judgment, their rejection, to solidify his status as this outsider, a man who lived and died on his own terms.
It's almost like a paradox, isn't it? Finding a sense of belonging in complete alienation.
Absolutely. It just highlights how complex human existence really is. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about what it means to belong, to be accepted, to live a life that's meaningful, and to really confront what matters when we're facing our own mortality.
Yeah, it really makes you think about what's truly important in the end. But we've been focusing a lot on Meursault's actions and his trial. But what about his inner world? I mean, there are these glimpses throughout the book, these moments where we can kind of see how his mind works, what's going on in there.
One really good example is how he copes in prison. Not with these grand ideas or anything, but by just meticulously reconstructing his old room in his memory.
It sounds so simple, but it says a lot about him, about how he experiences the world.
It does. He finds order and a sense of control. By focusing on the concrete, on the physical, it highlights this theme that we keep seeing of those sensory details being his primary way of processing the world.
Which brings us back to that scene on the beach again. The sensory overload, the heat, the sun, that glint of the knife, all building to the shooting.
Which raises a really important question. How much control did Mersault really have over his actions? Is he cold, a calculating killer? Or a man who was overwhelmed by forces that he couldn't even comprehend, let alone resist?
I mean, the jury, they wrestled with that. They ultimately condemned him. But as readers, we're left with this unsettling ambiguity. Camus blurs the lines between intention and circumstance. It challenges us to think about how complex human motivation really is.
And that ambiguity is central to The Stranger. It's not just a simple morality tale of good versus evil. It's about the human condition, our struggle to find meaning in a world that often feels absurd and indifferent, a world where easy answers, they just don't exist.
And so much of this novel seems to come back to this idea of the absurd. But for people who might not be super familiar with that concept, can you break it down a little bit? What does it mean to live in an absurd world?
Well, the absurd, it comes from that clash between our human desire for meaning and purpose and the fact that the universe just doesn't have those things. It's the realization that our search for absolute truth and meaning might be pointless.
So how do we even wrap our heads around that? How do we live authentically when we're faced with the absurd?
Camus suggests that instead of trying to force meaning onto a meaningless world, we should embrace the freedom that comes from accepting this absurdity. It's about finding joy in those simple, concrete experiences in life, much like Mersault does, with all of his observations.
So it's about accepting that we don't have all the answers, and maybe that's okay.
Exactly. And maybe it's also about recognizing the limitations of human judgment. Remember, Mersault is condemned not just for his actions, but because he can't or won't conform to those societal expectations of grief and remorse. It raises questions about truth and whether it can ever be truly objective.
It's like he's being punished for being authentic, for refusing to play a role that doesn't fit his experience.
Exactly. And this challenge to societal norms, it's something that still resonates with readers today. Mersault, despite his flaws and his questionable choices, he reminds us that conformity shouldn't come at the expense of our individual truth.
So if we step back from Meursault's actions for a minute, what are some of the bigger takeaways? From The Stranger, what can we as readers glean from all of this?
I think one of the key takeaways is the importance of living consciously, of being present in our own lives. Mersault, in his own way, embraces the immediacy of his experiences, whether it's the warmth of the sun or the taste of his coffee.
It's like a reminder to appreciate the small things, to find beauty and meaning in those everyday moments.
Exactly. And it's also a call to question our assumptions, to challenge those societal norms that tell us how to think, how to feel, how to behave. Meursault's journey encourages us to define our own meaning, our own purpose, even if it goes against the grain.
And to do it with courage and with authenticity, even if other people don't understand.
Exactly. The Stranger doesn't give us easy answers or solutions. It challenges us to think critically, to face uncomfortable truths, and to create our own path in a world that can feel indifferent.
It's fascinating how much time we spend trying to analyze Meursault, to figure out what makes him tick, what his actions really mean. But maybe that's not the right approach. Maybe the point is that there isn't a simple explanation for him or his choices.
You might be right. He resists our attempts to categorize him, to label him as a hero or a villain, sane or insane. He exists in this space of ambiguity and forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding of human nature.
It's like he's a mirror reflecting our own biases back at us.
Yeah, and that's one reason why this book still resonates with readers. It's not a story with a clear moral or a neat and tidy ending. It leaves us with more questions than answers, which can be unsettling, but it can also be liberating.
Let's bring it back to our listeners for a second. Why should you care about this story? About sunshine and murder and existentialism? What can you take away from this?
Well, I think a key takeaway is the importance of being authentic. Meursault, despite everything, he lives according to his own internal compass. He doesn't conform to those societal pressures, even when it costs him.
He's not rebelling just for the sake of it. He's just trying to be true to himself, to live in a way that matches his experience of the world, even if it's radically different.
Exactly. And while we might not agree with what he does, or even fully understand it, there's something powerful about his commitment to his own truth. It makes you ask yourself, how often do we compromise our own truth to fit in, to avoid judgment, to meet expectations that don't resonate with us?
It reminds us that we have the power to define our own existence, to create meaning in a world that might feel indifferent. Maybe that means, like Mersault, finding beauty in the simple things. Or maybe it means having the courage to say no to the things that don't align with our values, even if it means being different.
Maybe it's about finding peace, even when things are uncertain, accepting that life is unpredictable, often absurd, and that our search for meaning might not lead us anywhere. Instead, we can focus on right now, find joy in the everyday, and connect with the world on our own terms.
So that's it, our deep dive into the stranger, into the world of Meursault, his actions, his trial, his whole philosophy. We've tried to unpack some of these complex ideas: existentialism, the absurd, the search for meaning, in a world that often feels indifferent.
But the real journey, it starts now. For you, the listener, it's up to you to grapple with these questions, to face the absurd, and figure out what authenticity means in your own life.
If the stranger teaches us anything, it's that there aren't easy answers, no one-size-fits-all solutions. But in that ambiguity, in that space of questioning, that's where we find the potential for real freedom. The freedom to create our own meaning, to live on our own terms, and to find beauty in the face of the absurd.
And I'll leave you with this. As you go through your day, as you navigate your own life, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were Mersault? Facing the same circumstances, what choices would you have made? And what do those choices tell you about how you understand life and death and the human condition? It really does make you think,
It does, about what matters, you
Right.
know, when it's all said and done. But we've been talking a lot about Meursault's actions, the trial. But what about what's going on inside his head? What about his inner world? I feel like there are these glimpses throughout the book, these little moments where we get a better understanding of how his mind works.
Yeah, like how he copes in prison. It's not about big ideas or anything like that. It's about him reconstructing his old room in his mind, meticulously going over every detail.
That's so interesting. Such a simple thing, but
Right.
it speaks volumes.
It does. He finds order and control by focusing on what's concrete,
Right.
on the physical world. It all comes back to this theme of sensory details being his main way
Yeah.
of processing everything.
Which brings us back to that scene on the beach. All those senses firing at once. The heat, the sun, the glint of that knife, and then the shooting.
It makes you wonder, how much control did he actually have? Was he just cold, a calculating killer? Or was he a man overwhelmed by forces he couldn't understand, let alone resist?
That's what the jury struggled with. And they condemned him in the end. But we're left with this unease, this ambiguity. Camus blurs those lines between intention and circumstance, making us really think about the complexities of human motivation.
And that's a big part of The Stranger. It's not a straightforward morality tale, good versus evil, that kind of thing. It's about what it means to be human, our struggle to find meaning in a world that often seems absurd, indifferent even, a world where those easy answers, we crave them, but they just don't exist.
You keep mentioning the absurd, but I think some people might not be totally familiar with what that means. Can you unpack that a bit? What is it to live in an absurd world?
The absurd, it's about that clash between our human need for meaning, for purpose, and the fact that the universe doesn't really offer those things.
Yeah.
It's that moment when you realize that our search for absolute truth, it might all be for nothing.
So then how do we live when we're faced with that, with the absurd?
Well, Camus suggests that instead of trying to impose meaning on a meaningless world, we embrace the freedom. That comes from recognizing the absurdity. It's about finding joy in the simple things, the concrete things, like Mersault and his observations.
So accepting that we don't have all the answers, and that maybe that's okay.
Right, and it also might be about realizing that human judgment, it has its limits. Remember, Mersault is judged, not just for what he did, but also because he won't or can't conform to what society expects. In terms of grief and remorse, it makes us question what truth really is and whether it can ever be objective.
He's being punished for being authentic, for refusing to play a part that doesn't ring true for him.
Yeah, and this challenge to societal norms, that's what still draws readers in. Mersault, yeah, he's flawed, makes some questionable choices, but he reminds us that conformity shouldn't come at the expense of our own truth.
So putting aside Mersault's actions for a moment, what are some of the big takeaways from The Stranger? Yeah. What can we as readers learn from this?
I think it's about living consciously, really being present in our lives. Mersault, in his own unique way, embraces the immediacy of his experiences, the warmth of the sun, the taste of a cup of coffee.
Appreciating those little things, finding beauty in the everyday.
Exactly, and it also encourages us to question what we think we know, to challenge those societal norms that dictate how we're supposed to think, feel, and behave. Mersault's journey, it pushes us to find our own meaning, our own purpose, even if it's not the popular thing to do.
And to do it with courage, with authenticity, even when people don't get it.
Exactly. The Stranger doesn't give us easy answers or clear-cut solutions. It forces us to think critically, to confront the hard truths, and to forge our own path in a world that can feel indifferent. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We spend all this time trying to figure out Mersault, what makes him do what he does, what it all means.
Yeah, like we're trying to solve a puzzle.
Exactly, but maybe that's the wrong way to look at it. Maybe there isn't a neat little answer.
Maybe the point is there's no simple explanation for him or his choices.
Right, he's not easy to pin down.
Right.
We try to categorize him, hero or villain, sane or insane, but he doesn't fit. He exists in this ambiguous space, and in doing so, he forces us to confront the limits of what we think we know about human nature.
It's like he's holding up a mirror, showing us our own biases.
Precisely.
We see what we want to see in him.
And that's part of the reason this book is still so relevant. It doesn't give us easy answers or a nice, clean ending. It leaves us with questions.
More questions than answers.
Which can be unsettling,
definitely,
but also kind of freeing.
For sure. But let's bring it back to our listeners. You're sitting here listening to us talk about sunshine and murder and this concept of the absurd. So why should you care? What's the takeaway for you?
Well, one big takeaway is about being true to yourself, about authenticity. You know, Mersault, with all his flaws, he lives by his own code. He doesn't give in to societal pressure, to expectations, even when it costs him.
It's not about rebellion. For him, it's about being genuine, living a life that aligns with his own experience, even if it's completely different from everyone else.
Right. And we may not agree with his choices. We may not even understand them. But there's something powerful there, that commitment to his own truth. It makes you think. How often do we compromise ourselves to fit in, to please others, to meet expectations? That don't really mean anything to us.
It's a reminder that we can define our own existence. We can find meaning, even in a world that might feel indifferent. Maybe that means appreciating the simple things like Meursault with the sunshine. Or maybe it means having the courage to say no to things that don't feel right.
Maybe it's about finding peace with not knowing everything, accepting that life is unpredictable and often doesn't make sense, and that searching for all the answers might not get us anywhere. So instead, we focus on now. We find joy in the everyday, and we engage with the world in a way that feels true to us.
So that wraps up our deep dive into The Stranger. We've explored Mersault's world, his actions, his trial, his way of thinking. We've touched on some pretty big ideas: existentialism, the absurd, and the search for meaning in a world that often feels indifferent.
And now it's your turn to sit with these questions, to confront this idea of the absurd, and to define what authenticity means for you.
If there's one thing The Stranger teaches us, it's that there's no easy answer, no one right way to live. But that ambiguity, that uncertainty, that's where real freedom lies. The freedom to create our own meaning, to live on our own terms, and to find beauty, even in the face of the absurd.
So as you go about your day, ask yourself this. If you were in Mersault's shoes, what would you do? What choices would you make? And what would those choices reveal? about how you understand life, death, and what it means to be human.